A little girl went out for a routine walk and vanished without a trace. Everything seemed quite strange and unsettling, and the search for the girl turned into a real puzzle for the locals and the police. They managed to find a few disturbing clues that led to grim thoughts, but the case remained unsolved for a full 30 years. As time passed, the investigation hit dead ends, and with each passing day, it seemed like the truth was slipping away. However, decades later, thanks to modern technologies and relentless detective work, the mystery of Melissa's disappearance was finally unraveled. But as often happens in such stories, the answers led to new, even more terrifying questions, which remain unanswered to this day. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1, 1977, in the American city of Lawrence, located in Massachusetts. Her early years were not easy. When she was just 1 month old, for reasons unknown, her biological parents decided to give her up for adoption. That's when Melissa's adoptive parents, Jeanette and Robert Tremblay, came into her life, as she moved with her new family to a small, quiet town called Salem, where she spent her childhood. Melissa grew up as a very active and cheerful girl. From a young age, she showed an interest in fashion, carefully selecting her outfits with a keen eye for detail, and she also had a passion for music, especially singing. Her school years were full of friendship and fun. She was always surrounded by peers, made friends easily, and maintained close relationships with those she cared about. After school, she actively participated in a club similar to the Boy Scouts, where children learned outdoor survival skills, developed teamwork, and helped each other, which Melissa particularly appreciated. When she was just 9 years old, her adoptive parents divorced, which was a serious blow for her. After the divorce, her father almost disappeared from her life, while her mother tried to start new relationships. Over time, Jeanette began dating another man, who was also named Robert. September 11, 1988, became a tragic day for the Tremblay family. Melissa was 11 years old when she accompanied her mother to Lawrence, a small but lively town, where Jeanette was supposed to meet her then-boyfriend Robert. They regularly spent time at a local bar. Jeanette often took Melissa with her since she had no one to leave her daughter with. To keep Melissa from getting bored among the adults, her mother allowed her to play outside near the bar. She always gave her the same instruction, not to wander too far. Melissa obeyed, but her curious and active nature made solitary walks feel dull. Fortunately, with frequent visits to Lawrence, the girl had made friends with local kids who lived nearby. On that day, everything seemed to be going as usual. Melissa spent most of her time outside, occasionally coming into the bar to check in on her mother. Around noon, during one of these quick visits, the bartender, who was used to seeing Melissa often, decided to treat her to some popcorn. Smiling, he handed her a fresh portion, but Melissa replied that she would come back for it soon. She ran back outside to continue her walk, leaving the bartender and her mother expecting her to return shortly. Time passed, but Melissa never came back for her popcorn. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jeanette began to grow anxious. She was used to Melissa disappearing from sight for a few hours from time to time, but this time her intuition told her something was wrong. Worried, the woman stepped outside, hoping to find her daughter playing on one of the nearby streets, but Melissa was nowhere to be found. Her heart began to race and panic started to set in. Jeanette returned to the bar, shared her concerns with Robert, and together they set off to search for the girl. Their search lasted for several hours. They walked through every street around the bar, knocked on doors, asked passersby, but no one had seen Melissa. By 8 o'clock, the area had been combed thoroughly, but there was no trace of the girl. As darkness fell, the situation became even more terrifying. At 9 o'clock in the evening, completely desperate, Jeanette turned to the police. The officers, realizing the seriousness of the situation, immediately joined the search, but the darkness had fallen over the streets, hiding any possible traces, making the search much more difficult. Despite their best efforts, the police were unable to find a single clue late into the night. The investigators considered many possibilities, one of which was the assumption that Melissa might have run away on her own. However, her mother, Jeanette, categorically rejected this theory. She knew her daughter better than anyone and was certain that Melissa would never have dared to run away. The girl had always been afraid of the dark, and even short walks after sunset made her anxious. This conviction made Jeanette feel more and more worried with each passing minute. The search continued throughout the next day. Officers, volunteers, and family friends thoroughly examined the entire area. Hours passed, but there were no results. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when hope seemed to be fading, an unexpected call came in to the police. So on the other end of the line was a railway worker. He was doing his usual job, conducting a routine inspection of an old rail yard located just a few hundred meters from the bar where Melissa had disappeared. This rail yard had once been an important part of the city's infrastructure, but most of it had since fallen into disrepair. The yard was vast, with many hidden corners between the massive tracks and abandoned train cars, places where people rarely ventured. In one of these secluded spots, the worker noticed something unusual. Between two empty freight cars, he saw something that immediately alarmed him. He cautiously approached and, with horror, realized that he was looking at a human body. Without wasting time, he quickly called the police. Detectives arrived at the scene immediately and, with heavy hearts, began to examine the area. It took them only a few minutes to realize they had found the body of Melissa Tremblay. The girl had a small bag with her, inside of which the detectives found a card from a children's organization with her name on it. This confirmed their worst fears. Melissa's body was found right on the train tracks, but what shocked everyone was its condition. One of her legs had been severed, and the detectives began to doubt that a train accident had caused her death. The whole scene looked odd. How could the girl have ended up in such a place? The lead detective immediately noticed several details that didn't fit the theory of an accident on the tracks. The first thing that caught his attention was the girl's bag. It was found 20 meters away from the body, some distance from the tracks. If her death had been caused by an accident, such as being struck by a train, how could the bag have ended up so far away? It wasn't just strange, it was nearly impossible. With his experience investigating similar cases, the detective knew that such small details are rarely coincidental. He headed to the spot where the bag had been found and carefully examined the area. Nearby, he noticed a cluster of marks on the ground, multiple footprints, as if there had been a struggle or something had been dragged. Adding to the suspicion, there were drops of blood on the grass, further reinforcing his doubts. Everything pointed to a struggle and likely an attack had taken place there. These findings immediately led the detective to consider the possibility that Melissa had been the victim of a crime. It all seemed like an attempt to stage an accident. The perpetrator had hoped that a train collision would obscure the true cause of death. Another key factor that suggested foul play was the location itself. The abandoned rail yard, surrounded by dozens of empty, rusting train cars, was known as a haven for people living on the margins of society. The detective suspected that someone from this group could have attacked Melissa, taking advantage of her being alone. Meanwhile, the police ramped up their efforts to find any clues that could shed light on what had happened. However, there were no further traces at the scene that could directly point to the identity of the perpetrator. This complicated the investigation, and the detectives had to turn to a different approach, looking for witnesses. The first step was to reconstruct the timeline of events. To do this, they decided to interview employees of the railway company who might have been nearby at the time of the incident. One railway worker told the police that the day before the body was found, he had seen a girl matching Melissa's description, walking near the train tracks, seemingly unaware of the danger. He had sternly told her to leave, as the area was hazardous for children, especially in the evening. The girl appeared to understand his warning and hurriedly left the area. Continuing the investigation, the police found a woman who lived near the bar where Melissa had disappeared. It turned out she had known the girl for several months. Melissa often came to her house to play with her children, and they had become friends. On that fateful day, Melissa had again come to her house, hoping to invite the kids to play outside, but the woman refused. Her children were grounded for misbehavior and couldn't go outside. Disappointed, Melissa left on her own. The woman noted that the girl looked as usual and gave no indication that something might go wrong. Then the investigators found another witness who provided crucial information to the investigation. The man claimed to have seen a girl who looked like Melissa near an intersection not far from the rail yard. She was talking to the driver of a van. This episode immediately caught the investigators' attention. The man described the driver as fairly large, with an unkempt appearance, around 30 years old. He had thick dark hair and a beard. The van he was in looked old and rusty, brown in color. This witness testimony gave the investigators their first significant lead. The van driver might have been directly involved in Melissa's disappearance, and he could have been the last person to see her alive. The police began an active search for a van matching this description, checking city reports and trying to find owners of such vehicles. Bulletin on the man and his vehicle was circulated among police officers, and every suspect fitting the description was thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, medical experts completed their work on Melissa's body and provided an official report. The forensic experts carefully examined Melissa's body and came to shocking conclusions. The victim had multiple abrasions and 3 stab wounds, which the pathologists believed were the cause of her death. These stab wounds were inflicted with apparent force and precision, leading to the conclusion that this was a deliberate murder. Further analysis revealed that the blows were delivered by the left hand, narrowing the circle of suspects to left-handed individuals. Although no signs of sexual assault were found, nor any biological samples, it was clear that the perpetrator had made an effort to hide any evidence. Nothing was found on the girl's clothing or body that could lead the investigation to a specific person. No fingerprints, no traces of foreign DNA. These findings forced the detectives to reclassify the case. Now they were officially treating it as a murder. However, there was a problem. They had only one lead: the van seen near the site of Melissa's disappearance. The man in the old rusty van had been spotted near the girl, but that alone was not enough. The police began searching for similar vehicles, but each time they investigated an owner, they reached a dead end. This task became increasingly difficult for several reasons. First, even if they found the right van, how could they prove that its owner was guilty of the murder? At that time, forensic technology was still in its early stages. DNA analysis was not as widely used as it is today, and the detectives couldn't rely on modern methods to identify the perpetrator. Moreover, if the criminal had been in the van, he had clearly taken care not to leave any traces. The police also made desperate efforts to find new witnesses. They interviewed hundreds of residents in the area where the girl had disappeared. However, these efforts yielded no results. No one could recall anything useful or significant that could move the investigation forward, even by a small step. For several months, the police did not stop their search, and investigators repeatedly returned to the existing evidence, hoping they had missed something. But over time, the Melissa Tremblay case soon grew cold, as often happens with unsolved crimes. Meanwhile, the case gained widespread media coverage, attracting public attention. Unfortunately, one of the most commonly discussed theories began to blame Melissa's mother. Some believed that her negligence was the cause of the tragedy, and the media began to focus on this version. Jeanette found herself in the spotlight, criticized for allowing her daughter to walk around alone, and her image as a mother became a target for public judgment. What angered people even more was the fact that, while Melissa wandered aimlessly for hours by herself, her mother was spending time in the bar, engrossed in conversations and alcohol. For many, this became a glaring example of negligence, and public opinion quickly turned against Jeanette. Amid these rumors and accusations, the public also directed their outrage at social services, which many believed had failed Melissa. People demanded answers as to why state authorities didn't intervene earlier, knowing about the family's struggles. Under pressure from journalists, representatives of Child Protective Services stated that they were aware of the issues within the Tremblay family and had indeed tried to take action. However, they noted that the question of removing Jeanette's parental rights had never been seriously considered, as there had been no grounds for such drastic measures at the time. Meanwhile, the case itself stagnated. The police repeatedly reviewed all the materials, tried to find new suspects, and rechecked old theories, but all their efforts proved futile. The case hit a dead end, and it seemed that justice for Melissa would never be achieved. It wasn't until years later, in 2000, 12 years after the murder, that investigators managed to identify a new suspect, serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells. This man was known for his brutal crimes, and investigators began considering his possible involvement in Melissa's death. Tommy Lynn Sells, a serial killer who confessed to 22 murders, became one of the first major leads in the investigation of Melissa Tremblay's case. His horrifying signature partially matched the details of Melissa's murder. For instance, Sells was known to often hide in abandoned train cars while traveling across various states, which aligned with the location where Melissa's body was found. Additionally, his appearance resembled the description of the van driver who had been seen with the girl on the day of her disappearance. All of this pointed to the possibility of his involvement in the crime, and investigators began to seriously consider him as a suspect. However, after thorough analysis and verification of his alibi, detectives were forced to admit that the theory involving Sells did not hold up. No evidence was found to place him in Lawrence in 1988, when Melissa disappeared. On the contrary, they determined that during that time, Tommy Lynn Sells had been in another state, far from the scene of the crime. This was a significant blow to the investigation, as the serial killer theory had seemed promising, but it ultimately led to a dead end. Several more years passed without any significant breakthroughs until, in 2013, the case unexpectedly took a new turn, thanks to completely unforeseen information. During the investigation of a completely unrelated case, a man from Lawrence was arrested. During his interrogation, he unexpectedly made a statement that caught the investigators' attention. The man claimed to know some details about the murder of Melissa Tremblay. This was highly unexpected, as his arrest had nothing to do with Melissa's case, but his words gave the investigators a new opportunity to uncover the mystery. The man explained that in 1988, when he was just 13 years old, he was involved in car theft and often spent time on the streets scouting for vehicles. On the day Melissa disappeared, he happened to see the girl sitting on the steps outside the bar. Next to her was a man named Mike, whom the witness knew. Mike had a bad reputation among the locals, and the witness's parents had often warned him to stay away from him. This name immediately piqued the investigators' interest. Mike was known for his questionable behavior and criminal connections, and although he had not initially attracted police attention in Melissa's case, his possible presence near the girl on the day of her disappearance could be a crucial lead for further investigation. About 10 minutes later, while retracing his steps, the witness noticed the same girl again, but this time, she was no longer sitting on the steps. Instead, she was walking away from the bar with Mike. As the boy saw Melissa and Mike walking together, his attention was drawn to another detail. A second man, whom the witness didn't recognize, joined them. The three of them continued walking down the street, disappearing into the darkness of the night. This detail raised concerns for the investigators, as it suggested there may have been another accomplice with Mike. When the police asked the witness why he had remained silent for 25 years, he explained his reasoning quite simply. He didn't want to interact with the police more than necessary. However, after learning about Melissa's murder, the witness felt increasingly uneasy. Remembering what he had seen, he asked his brother whether he should tell the police. His brother, not wanting to draw attention to their family, advised him to keep quiet. And so for over 2 decades, the witness kept silent, until he happened to be in police custody for another matter. Despite the fact that his story sounded intriguing and could have been an important lead, the detectives soon found significant inconsistencies in it. First, the man claimed to have seen the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside. However, it was known that Melissa had been reported missing around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when it was still daylight. This clear discrepancy in timing immediately raised doubts for the investigators. Moreover, knowing that by the time of Melissa's disappearance, all the bar's patrons and staff had been alerted and actively participated in the search, it seemed highly unlikely that the girl could have been sitting right outside the establishment and gone unnoticed. Both Melissa's mother and the police had thoroughly searched the area around the bar, and if Melissa had been sitting on the steps, she would have been seen. These facts led the detectives to 2 possible conclusions. Either the witness had mistaken another girl for Melissa, or his testimony was inaccurate or distorted by time and his memory. Despite the shortcomings in the witness's testimony, investigators decided to look into Mike's possible involvement in the murder. They thoroughly examined his past and tried to find any connections to Melissa's disappearance, but their efforts were unsuccessful. No progress was made in the case. However, the story provided by the witness reignited interest in this cold case, and in 2014, it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis technology had advanced significantly, and investigators hoped that it could shed light on the tragic events. Returning to the available evidence, the police reviewed all the materials they had: Melissa's clothing, her personal items, and everything collected from the crime scene. However, attempts to find foreign DNA on her clothing yielded no results. At first, this seemed like another dead end, but there was still one potentially important piece of evidence left. During the initial examination of Melissa's body in 1988, experts had taken samples from under her fingernails, assuming she might have tried to defend herself by scratching her attacker. These samples had been preserved for decades, and now, with more advanced technology, they were sent for analysis. The result was promising, experts discovered traces of foreign skin. The skin particles were sent to a laboratory, and from them, a DNA profile of an unknown male was extracted. However, the problem was that the profile was only partial and insufficient for a definitive match with anyone in existing databases. The police knew that with a partial profile, the chances of finding the culprit were slim. But with the advancement of technology, they turned to a genealogy company that specialized in finding familial connections through DNA. The company's experts took on the difficult task of using the genetic fragment to search for potential matches in vast genealogical databases. Through years of meticulous work, the researchers were able to identify a possible relative of the person whose DNA was found under Melissa's nails. The genetic connection led investigators to a specific family with the last name McClendon. This discovery was a major step forward in the investigation, and detectives focused on examining members of this family, trying to determine who might have been involved in the murder. However, the main challenge remained the lack of a full DNA profile to conclusively prove someone's guilt. Investigators began to delve into the history of each family member, focusing on those who could have been in Lawrence in 1988. Eventually, they narrowed their suspects down to two brothers, one of whom, Marvin McClendon, became the primary focus. At the time, Marvin was living in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 1980s, he had lived just 20 minutes from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter. This information marked a key turning point in the investigation, as it meant Marvin could have physically been in the area at the right time. However, further findings were even more striking. Investigators discovered that in the late 1980s, Marvin McClendon frequently traveled to work at a church located just a few hundred meters from the bar where Melissa was last seen. This fact linked him to the location of the girl's disappearance and heightened suspicions. Another important discovery concerned Marvin's vehicle. Detectives found out that during those years he owned an old brown van, which he used for work. This van closely resembled the one seen near Melissa on the day of her disappearance. All of these details were gradually coming together, connecting Marvin McClendon to the murder of Melissa Tremblay. However, to definitively prove his guilt, the investigators still needed to gather additional evidence. Nevertheless, this discovery was the most significant breakthrough in the investigation in decades. Although Marvin McClendon had no criminal record, aside from numerous fines for not wearing a seatbelt, his background proved interesting to investigators. He had been married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. From his first marriage, Marvin had two sons, but we show sources he showed little interest in raising them and rarely participated in their lives. What caught the investigators' attention the most was the fact that Marvin was left-handed. This detail played a crucial role in the investigation, as experts had previously determined that the wounds inflicted on Melissa were likely caused by a left-handed person. Interestingly, none of Marvin's close male relatives were left-handed, which made Marvin unique in this regard and added to the suspicion surrounding him. As detectives continued to delve into his past, tragedy continued to haunt Melissa's family. In 2015, her mother, Jeanette, passed away at the age of 70, never knowing who was responsible for her daughter's death. After analyzing all the available information about Marvin, studying his relatives and history, detectives concluded that he was the most likely suspect in Melissa Tremblay's murder. In 2021, decades after the crime, investigators traveled to Alabama. During the interrogation, Marvin appeared calm and composed. When asked about his life during those years, he provided some general details but seemed hesitant to recall that time. However, when police directly asked him about the Melissa Tremblay case, he adamantly denied any involvement in the murder. He insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime and tried to dismiss all accusations. But the investigators weren't ready to give up. When they informed Marvin that DNA from the victim's body belonged to one of his close relatives, he made a surprising turn in his testimony. He claimed that if that were true, the killer might have been his own brother. That same year, Marvin agreed to voluntarily provide a DNA sample for analysis. However, even after this, the experts were unable to establish a full match with the partial sample found under Melissa's nails. Despite this, investigators continued to insist that Marvin remained the prime suspect and kept searching for additional evidence that could definitively confirm his involvement in the girl's murder. All the clues and circumstantial evidence pointed to Marvin. Nevertheless, they realized that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely difficult to present irrefutable proof of his guilt. The prosecution, relying on the partial DNA profile, faced a serious challenge. Legally proving guilt based on such evidence is difficult, especially if the defense focused on the lack of direct evidence. But the investigators were determined not to give up. Over the next year, they continued working on the case, desperately trying to find additional leads to strengthen their argument. In the following months, detectives visited Marvin multiple times, continuing to question him. They asked him more and more questions, hoping that he would eventually slip up or give them a reason to arrest him. Finally, in April 2022, after gathering all available evidence and analyzing testimonies, investigators decided to arrest Marvin McClendon. Although he continued to adamantly deny his guilt, his arrest provided the detectives with something unexpected. When the officers took him into custody, Marvin uttered a strange phrase that made everyone pause. "At least I got 20 years of my pension." These words sounded suspicious, as if he was summing up some unfinished business or acknowledging that his life had been successful up to that point, despite hidden crimes. At the time, Marvin was 74 years old, and despite his claims of innocence, he was sent to jail to await trial. In the investigators' opinion, this phrase might have been an inadvertent confession, or a hint that he acknowledged his responsibility for what had happened in 1988. Now the investigation only had to wait for the trial, where all the collected evidence and testimonies would be presented in court to finally bring justice for Melissa Tremblay. The trial of Marvin McClendon was surrounded by many complexities and peculiarities which only fueled public interest in the case. One of these was the judge's decision to place Marvin under constant protection. This was not done without reason. Other inmates quickly learned what he was accused of. As for the trial itself, the prosecution's key strategy was the method of elimination. Without direct, irrefutable evidence, such as a full DNA profile, the prosecution used every circumstantial fact to link Marvin to the murder. DNA found under Melissa's nails definitively belonged to someone in the McClendon family. And while none of Marvin's close relatives fit the description of the perpetrator or had an alibi, the genetic material match remained an important argument. Additionally, the prosecution relied on circumstances that linked Marvin to the crime scene. In 1988, he regularly visited a church located on the same street as the bar where Melissa was last seen. Moreover, he owned an old brown van, which matched the description of the vehicle a witness had seen near the girl on the day of her disappearance. All these facts, though circumstantial, were presented as evidence that Marvin could have been the murderer. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately attacked the weak points of the prosecution's case. His main argument was that the absence of a full DNA profile of the perpetrator made it impossible to prove his client's guilt. He insisted that a partial DNA profile was not sufficient grounds to accuse someone of such a serious crime. The lawyer also decided to bring in experts to challenge key elements of the case. One of the defense's witnesses was a forensic expert who, based on crime scene photos, stated that she could not confirm the theory that the killer was left-handed. This statement cast doubt on one of the investigators' key conclusions, which had suggested that the stab wounds were inflicted by someone using their left hand, specifically Marvin. Marvin's lawyer sought to highlight every flaw in the investigation and uncertainty in the evidence, hoping to undermine confidence in the case. However, the prosecution, despite all the obstacles, continued to insist that all the circumstantial facts, when pieced together, pointed to Marvin as the likely culprit. The second expert, called by the defense, was a genetics specialist. He argued that the match of a partial DNA profile with one family was not conclusive evidence of guilt. According to him, a partial profile could match not only immediate relatives but also more distant ones, of which anyone could have hundreds or even thousands. This statement essentially questioned the prosecution's key piece of evidence, making the jury consider the possibility of an error. The genetic link was not clear enough to definitively state that the DNA belonged to Marvin. Marvin himself, despite having the opportunity, chose not to testify in his defense. He opted for a strategy of silence, relying on his lawyers and experts. The jury deliberations dragged on for almost a week, with many disagreements about the evidence. Finally, on December 27th, they announced that they could not reach a unanimous decision. Some jurors believed that without a full DNA profile, it was impossible to be certain of Marvin's guilt. This split within the jury forced the judge to declare a mistrial. For the prosecution, this was a major setback, but the case was not yet over. In early 2024, the prosecution confirmed its intention to hold a retrial. The new trial is set to begin on September 30th, 2024. Until then, Marvin remains in custody, awaiting the outcome of the new proceedings. The man is now 76 years old and suffers from numerous chronic health conditions. His health has raised concerns, and there is a possibility that he may not live to see the trial's conclusion. If the retrial once again fails to result in a guilty verdict, Marvin could be released, and the Melissa Tremblay case could remain unsolved. That's all for now. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and leave a like. Thank you for your attention, and see you in the next episode.